Okay, so on to week 9. So we're talking about sustainable buildings this week. I want you to watch this video. It's not very long. I think it's like 6 minutes, where they talk about regenerative buildings, which you know, I actually personally believe, and a lot, as do a lot of others, that we need to start thinking beyond just sort of this sustainability and onto regenerative thinking and applying that to everything that we can. It's most commonly applied to agriculture. You may have heard of regenerative agriculture before, um, but you can apply it to anything, really, at least as a philosophy. And if it's applied to buildings, the idea here is that instead of just kind of not being bad for the environment, how about they regenerate aspects of the natural environment? So instead of just like sort of staying here, we want to maybe get better instead of not getting worse. Okay, so it's worth watching and worth thinking about as we move forward. We'll actually look at regenerative agriculture a little bit later. Okay, so we're going to look at both some of the principles in sustainable building design, but also some certification systems and some of the differences between those certifications and how we think about sustainability of buildings. Okay, so the built environment is a really important part of our impact on the world, I guess you could say. So about 40% of the energy use is used in buildings and something like 35% of the emissions. It's all just from us being inside of buildings. And then there's also water. There's natural resources, the things used to build the buildings, the waste from the buildings. So they're a really big impact. People say we spend 90 to 95% of our lives inside of buildings. So in addition to our impact on the world, what about the impact of the building on us? And that's another aspect of sustainable building design, is thinking about the occupants inside of them and, keeping the air healthy and not putting toxins in from all of the off-gassing from all of the things around you, having natural light to help us feel better and heal, and using a lot of plants and what's something called biophilia, where you basically have all these natural patterns which our brains still react positively to, just from basically how we evolved in nature. And then so there's this deep-seated part of our brain that really just subconsciously feels better and more at ease among natural patterns and plants and so forth. So there's all kinds of aspects to this that, again, we're just scratching the surface, but there's a lot to consider here. And so you really want to think about how buildings impact sustainability. That's like the core of it. And then we'll go over the specifics of passive solar design, which is a common sort of set of techniques that people that work in buildings know. Most people should know, I guess. Let me modify that a little bit. So sustainable design is going to use passive design, and then we'll look at the LEED, which you've probably heard of before, LEED design, and then living building challenges. Not a lot of people have heard of. We'll talk about that as well. Okay, so passive solar design, we'll look at these different principles, the orientation, overhangs, windows, thermal mass. There are these different elements of passive design. There is actually a passive house certification, which I mentioned there briefly. And then we'll look at, this is something where, we're talking about this like, hey, we're these big fancy modern types that, found all these really interesting ways to make buildings more sustainable. Well, actually, for thousands of years, humans have known these techniques. We just kind of forgot them. Or I guess more specifically, we were able to build buildings without considering them anymore. And so we'll look at some of these ancient uses of them, from the Greeks to the Romans to Native American populations. And then I have a video here with a really nice example of different elements that are of passive design all in one building. And so this is a really great, I think, accessible and I think understandable explanation and really beautiful design for how to integrate some of these passive design elements. Really, really interesting house. And then we'll go over these certifications, LEED and living buildings. And so LEED is this Leadership in Energy Environmental Design. This is the one, if you know anything about sustainable buildings, you've probably at least heard of this. So this is where you have the different rating systems. This has been around since the 90s, the late 90s. We'll go over the different certifications levels, the different LEED certification levels, and then go over a case study of a couple of one case study of a place here. And then there's some critiques of LEED. So, as I always like to do, if I can, provide varying perspectives on this. And so not everyone's the biggest fan of LEED. Some people think there's been a little bit of industry capture and it's just not as authentic as some others. But, LEED is the one that really started this modern sustainable building movement. So there is definitely something to be said for it. There is some imperfections, but it's also really thorough if you do it the right way. You go for that platinum design, which is the top level design in particular. That's actually pretty hard to get. And then we'll go over the living building standard, which is it's like LEED on steroids, basically. So I've read a lot of these. I've looked at a lot of different sustainable ways to do sustainable building certification, and this is by far the most robust one that I've ever seen. And you'll see why. I mean, you have to check every single box. You have to demonstrate it for a longer period of time. Like, there's all kinds of things. Like, it's really hard to get this certification. There's only a handful of truly, what are they called, living buildings in the world today. Where LEED, there are millions of LEED buildings all over the place. And there's a case study of a living building, just to give you an example of what one would look like. And then I also added something about tiny homes and cooperative housing. So tiny homes, if you're not familiar with them, you'll go over those. This is a movement that's been around again since probably the late 90s or early 2000s. And it's a pretty interesting movement, still going pretty strong. And then there's a video here that actually is one of the places we'll see in Colorado. So this is a little tiny home village, beloved village in Denver. So I actually posted this video probably 5 years ago, and then here we are, we're seeing it. So there's a nice video of a place we'll see in Colorado. And then I finished with cooperative housing, which is something that we don't use a lot in the United States. This is much more common in Europe. I've seen a bunch of these in Europe, and it's actually a really interesting living model. There are cooperative housing units in the United States, including nearby. There's some in Philly. I'm not familiar. I'm not sure there's any in Delaware, but this is something that has not quite caught on in the United States because we're not as much of a, I guess we don't have the community orientation that Europeans tend to have, and Europeans are more used to living like among each other and strangers and being more social in their communities and so forth. So it's more in the culture than we have it, but I think it's something that could be really it could catch on because there's a lot of reasons that it's good, not just for sort of resource sustainability, because people are sharing resources instead of everybody having the same thing, but it also helps develop community cohesion, and we need more social connections. That's something that is lacking in general in the United States. I'm not saying it's not there, but cooperative housing sort of facilitates all of that. And it's really an efficient way to use resources, because instead of every single family having their own washing machine, they share a washing machine. Every single family having their own full kitchen, they share a kitchen. So in that way, it's a really great way to share resources. But it's also generally less expensive because, again, you don't own everything. And it's less, it's like more, less square footage per person as well. So anyway, it's food for thought. And more than anything, just wanted to put this on your radar because maybe this is something that'll catch on, or maybe you can become an advocate for it. Maybe you'll find a cooperative housing somewhere down the road and won't be so odd to you. I'd be interested to hear if you would like to live in cooperative housing, if that's something you'd like to do. If the opportunity were presented to you. I'm just curious. Some people are like, no, I need my own space. And you still get your own space, of course. Like, you're not sharing a bedroom with someone. You basically have your own private space, but then you have a lot of community areas as well. So anyway, pretty interesting model. Who knows? Maybe it'll catch on someday. I hope it does, because it's a good potential part of the solution. Okay, so that is our overview of the sustainable building lesson. So hopefully you learn a lot, and maybe some of this will resonate with you. And as I say, we will see at least one of these places when we go out to Colorado. And I know we'll also talk about things like lead design out there, and maybe even living buildings. Who knows? Okay, well, I hope you enjoy the content.